for a great part of Alaska, and this is the Alaska Native community in my state. These are incredible, patriotic Americans. By the way, Alaska Natives serve at higher rates in the military than any other ethnic group in the country. They are great Americans. They add so much to our state. They are the first peoples of Alaska. And so in my state, it's almost about 20% of the population, Mr. President. So it's a population I care deeply about. We work closely with them on so many different issues across so many different areas. And so I like to legislate in the areas that matter to them. And we're going to do that, lately, and I'm going to try and stay positive here. I've given speeches on the Senate floor about this before. Some of my Democratic colleagues on the other side of the aisle have taken it out on the Alaska Native people in legislation, really kind of bad stuff. Now, I'm not going to be negative, but there has been this trend of a anti-Alaska Native bias on the other side of the aisle. It's been very disappointing, to be honest, Mr. President. It's been puzzling. But I'm hoping today these two bills that we're going to move forward that go to the heart of Alaska Native culture in one and Alaska Native patriotism in the other are going to be UC'd. I know my Republican colleagues have already passed on these. So the first piece of legislation, Mr. President, I want to bring up is what we call the Alaska's Right to Ivory Sales and Tradition. The acronym on that is the Artists Act. Now, let me give you a little bit of background on this. For thousands of years, Alaska Natives have responsibly harvested whales, walrus, other marine mammals from our northern seas. These animals are eaten, shared, honored, and no part of the animal goes to waste. They still do this tradition in my state. They have the right to do it under law. The bones, the ivory, the baleen, even all of those pieces are used for beautiful art. If you've had a chance to visit my office, you've seen the beautiful art that adorns the walls of my Senate office, carvings made from whale baleen, walrus tusks, crafted by Alaska Native artists. Mr. President, this is some of those beautiful art in America. It is deeply ingrained in Alaska's culture, the ability to make this art. It also provides important economic opportunity for our artists in many of these remote villages, artists who rely on the ability to sell these works to Alaskans and the hundreds of thousands of people who come to my great state to visit, who want to take home a piece of Alaska Native heritage. So it's a win-win-win for everybody, but it's an economic driver of a lot of small villages in my state. And by the way, Mr. President, carving, harvesting walrus ivory is completely legal under federal law. Federal regulations, federal law, there's no question about that. However, there's been some, I guess, well-intentioned laws from some states that in an attempt to ban African elephant ivory, which we all want to do that, that's not allowed in America, by the way, states have gone too far and cast this huge net and have said, you can't buy any ivory products anywhere, including Alaska Native products from Alaska walrus harvested. This really has hurt my state. People coming up from states that have banned all ivory say, I can't take that home, I can't buy it, sorry. So, Mr. President, this is a simple bill. If a visitor wants to come buy some ivory earrings in Alaska by one of our great Alaska Native artists, and they bring them home to a state that has a ban on ivory, which is not sensible, again, walrus ivory, not Alaskan or not African elephant ivory. We want to be able to say at the federal level, we should be able to do this. So that's what my Artists Act does. It prohibits states from banning the importation, sale, or possession of Alaska Native handicrafts made with walrus ivory. Environmental groups support it. By the way, the Biden administration supported this. It's straightforward, bipartisan legislation that recently, Mr. President, passed unanimously the Commerce Committee. So, this is about as bipartisan as it gets. And Mr. President, what I want to do is to cut through the confusion that now exists with certain states and a lot of tourists in my great state, to affirm the right of the Alaska Native people to continue these centuries-old practices of sustainable, respectful ivory carving entirely within federal law, and to be able to make sure that's clarified across the country. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 178, that's Senate 254, further that the committee reported substitute amendment be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered, read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
So, Mr. President, to ask that the senator modify his request and the Senate proceed to the consideration of the following bills en bloc. Calendar item 178, Senate 254, and calendar item 169, Senate 318, that the committee reported substitute amendments be considered and agreed to en bloc. The bills as amended be considered, read a third time and passed en bloc, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table all en bloc.
Does the senator so modify his request?
Yes, I agree to the modification.
The clerk will report the bills en bloc.
Calendar number 178 S254 to amend the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 to protect the cultural practices and livelihoods of producers of Alaska Native handicrafts and marine mammal ivory products and for other purposes. Calendar number 169 S318 to require a plan to improve the cybersecurity and telecommunications of the U.S. academic research fleet and for other purposes.
Under the previous order, the committee reported substitutes are considered and agreed to. The bills as amended are considered read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid on the table all en bloc.
Mr. President, I want to just let people know back home that means that bill, the artist bill that we've been trying to get moved for a long time, just passed the United States Senate. So I want to thank my colleague from California, my friend from California who has worked with me. By the way, on one of the other bills that just passed, I was a co-sponsor with Senator Padilla on that. So there's good Senate cooperation on these issues. Now, Mr. President, so that's an important issue for Alaska Native heritage, culture, artists, and now it's passed the Senate. So again, I want to thank Senator Padilla. Now, I hope we can move to a next bill that, to be honest, should even be easier, because the bill I'm going to try and pass right now, pass the United States Senate in December, unanimously, already passed. So this should be a no-brainer. I hope my Senate colleague from California is on the floor here, ready to give this bill his full endorsement and not object to it. Mr. President, again, it already passed. It passed the House in July, so if we pass it right now, it's going to go to the President of the United States desk for a signing. And this is a really big deal for my constituents. Here's what it is, Mr. President. I talked about what I call the special patriotism of Alaska Natives. They serve at higher rates in the military than any other ethnic group in the country. They had a situation when so many, and I mean thousands and thousands of Alaska Natives were serving in Vietnam, when a whole host of Americans didn't want to serve in Vietnam. Alaska Natives answered the call. So we have tens of thousands of Vietnam vets. And when they came home, like a lot of Vietnam vets, they were not treated well. That was horrible. Our country should apologize for the horrible treatment our Vietnam vets got. Let's face it, as Alaska Natives, a lot of people still discriminated against Alaska Natives back then. They weren't treated well in that regard either. And finally, Mr. President, a law had changed when they were overseas. Alaska Native people used to have a right, starting in 1906, for a native allotment. That's 160 acres of land that if they could prove this is where their family raised them and hunted and fished, they could get that allotment, 160 acres. Well, when they were overseas fighting in Vietnam, that law changed. So here they are, serving their country when a lot of American males are avoiding service, and they get home and they're told, by the way, your allotment that you're supposed to be able to get, that you've wanted your whole life, that law changed and you can't do it anymore. Huge injustice. So, Mr. President, during the first Trump administration, I introduced legislation called the Alaska Native Vietnam Veterans Land Allotment Act, and it said, hey, if you were overseas or serving in the military and you came home and the ability to get your allotment extinguished, you shouldn't be penalized for fighting for your country. You get the extended time to get your allotment. So that bill passed. I was in the Oval Office when President Trump signed it. It was a great day for Alaska Native Vietnam veterans, very patriotic. It was a 5-year program, Mr. President. Unfortunately, we had Secretary Haaland implement it. Secretary Haaland did not implement it. Secretary Haaland, when she went through her confirmation hearing, committed to me twice, Senator, I will make this a priority of mine to implement this bill. You know what she did, Mr. President? She didn't do anything. Shamefully, because radical left-wing environmental groups told her, we don't want anyone else getting land in Alaska, she did 40 allotments out of well over almost 3,000 available. She dragged her feet. She delayed it for 2 years. So the 5-year program has almost run out of time because Secretary of the Interior, Haaland, was more interested in appeasing radical left-wing environmental groups than she was getting Alaska Natives their allotment, which is what the law demanded. So this bill is very simple. Because of that delay, it changes 2 words in the already passed law. It says 5 years to 10 years. It's just a 5-year extension to a bill that everybody agrees with. These patriotic Alaska Native Vietnam vets deserve their allotments. And they shouldn't have to suffer because of Secretary Haaland's delay tactics. So, Mr. President, this bill has already passed the House. This bill passed the Senate unanimously in December. And I'm really hoping that my Democratic colleagues, respecting the indigenous Native people of my state and their valiant Vietnam service, will join with me in just passing it like we did in December. And then it'll go right to the President's desk, and we'll have 5 more years to implement this really important piece of legislation. So, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 410, and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm actually very glad and encouraged that we were able to find a bipartisan approach to the Commerce Committee bills that we just passed just a few minutes ago. Not just because I know it's important to my colleague from Alaska and to his constituents, but so that Native Alaskans know that this side of the aisle also supports them as well. But as it pertains to these bills, I think we need to find a similar bipartisan approach on the energy and natural resource bills that Senator from Alaska is suggesting that we approve by unanimous consent. I'm actually more than happy and eager to sit down with my colleague and the chair and ranking member of the committee to put together a larger package of bills to ensure that both Republican and Democratic priorities reach the President's desk and get signed into law. I think historically we've been successful at avoiding a piecemeal approach, instances where only one party's priorities or one chamber's priorities reach the President's desk and get signed into law. And so I look forward to continuing to work in that spirit, to continue the conversation with my colleague from Alaska to arrive at a balanced bipartisan package of bills and work together to advance them. Therefore, I must object at this time.
The objection is heard. Senator from Alaska.
Mr. President, I appreciate my colleague from California's cooperation on the first bill, the Artists Act. Disappointed here on this one because, you know, it's a little bit of a delay tactic, but he certainly has my commitment to work with him to, if they need to pair this, to try to pair this. But I will say this. The 5 years of this bill expires at the end of this year, and we cannot, regardless if there's pairing or not pairing, we cannot let this bill expire. These great American patriots serve their country and deserve their allotment that they were unable to get during Vietnam. And then when we passed the bill, Secretary of Interior Holland purposely dragged her feet to make sure no Alaska Native or very few got their allotment. That was a disgrace. And so, Mr. President, my colleague from California, you have my commitment to work with you, but we got to get this done by the end of the year, before the end of the year, and get it on the President's desk. These great patriotic Americans deserve nothing less, and we can't delay much longer. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from North Dakota.
I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to complete their remarks prior to the scheduled roll call vote: Senator Grassley, Senator Kramer, and Senator Hoeven.
Without objection.
I give my remarks, leadership.
The senator from Iowa.
Ask unanimous. I'm sorry. Unanimous consent to waive the mandatory quorum call with respect to the Mascott nomination.
Without objection.
Today, we're going to move to our first vote on Professor Jennifer Mascott nomination to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit. I want to take a few minutes to express my support for her nomination and urge my colleagues to vote accordingly. Bipartisanship in this body has become unfortunately rare. Our government shut down because of partisan obstruction, and even the few instances of bipartisanship in our committee have been condemned by leftist dark money groups such as Demand Justice. The situation is bad for our country and really bad for the American people. Putting high-quality judicial nominees on the bench to serve the American people should be something that unites this body. In fact, in the Biden administration, that happened. Over 80% of the judicial nominees in that administration received bipartisan support on the floor. By contrast, this Congress, only 20% of the Trump nominees have had bipartisan support. I encourage my colleagues to ignore the pressure from inflammatory progressive groups like Demand Justice and to recognize Professor Mascott's tremendous qualifications. Professor Mascott is a law professor at Catholic University. She's so beloved by her students. She has had a very distinguished career as a public servant and has impeccable professional qualifications. Just as an example, as a law student at the George Washington University, she earned a record-breaking 4.22 GPA. Her professors even wrote to the Judiciary Committee prior to her hearing to explain that these professors often thought that her exam answers were better than their own answer keys. It's no surprise then that she went on to clerk for 2 Supreme Court justices. Since her time as a clerk, she's grown into an impressive and nationally influential scholar. Justices of the Supreme Court have cited her scholarship 8 times and even mentioned her by name in oral arguments. She's also well known and well respected by our own Senate Judiciary Committee. The committee has called on Professor Mascott repeatedly to testify about some of the toughest constitutional and statutory questions. She's also filed amicus briefs on behalf of members of the committee in very important cases. We trusted her judgment then, and we can surely trust that judgment now. I'm confident that Professor Mascott will make an outstanding judge, and I know that she'll serve the people of Delaware and the Third Circuit with distinction. President Trump made an excellent selection in Professor Mascott, and I hope my colleagues will join me in voting to support her nomination so she can serve on the Third Circuit. I yield the floor.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, I just want to supplement the distinguished chairman's remarks with one observation for the benefit of all of my colleagues, and that is that not long ago, when circuit court nominees were brought forward, they had cleared the Senate blue slip process because each circuit court seat was associated with a state, except for D.C., but normally a D.C. circuit court seat was associated with a state, and the senators from that state had the ability to recommend a nominee to the president. The Republicans on the Judiciary Committee undid that, what we call blue slip rule, for circuit courts. So senators lost that power. When we were in the majority, when President Biden was there were strident objections when we applied the same standard to circuit court nominees that the Republicans had applied when they broke the blue slip. With this nomination, we are taking it the next step further. Now, not only are the senators from the home state not consulted, but in this case, the candidate has almost no relationship with Delaware, the state with which this seat is associated. She has a summer house there. She's never had a driver's license. She's never had a fishing license. She's never had been a taxpayer, an income taxpayer. She's never been registered to vote. She's never been a member of the bar. She only recently joined the Third Circuit bar. She's been airdropped into this seat. So just be aware that in the future, when the shoe is on the other foot, and people here would like to make sure that their home state is honored and recognized as being the state with which a circuit court seat is associated, that may very well not happen any longer. And we'll look back to this minute as the minute that destroyed that tradition. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Mr. President, in a little while, we're going to vote to proceed to Senate Joint Resolution 62 that I introduced with Senator Hoeven to repeal the Biden administration's Bureau of Land Management Resource Management Plan for North Dakota. Of course, House Joint Resolution 105, which mirrors our bill introduced by Congresswoman Fedorchak, has already passed the House of Representatives, and final passage is scheduled for later this evening. The Bureau of Land Management, or BLM as we call it, is the landlord of over 745 million acres of land and subsurface deposits nationwide. BLM's management of these public resources is governed by what's known as the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, otherwise known as FLPMA, which requires, I stress, requires the Bureau to develop resource management plans, or RMPs, to guide management decisions. And when created, Congress was clear. These RMPs must abide by the multiple use mandate. Now, Mr. President, multiple use is a term that's thrown around a lot in the public lands discussions. It was championed by President Theodore Roosevelt, who drew from his experience in his 2 ranches in North Dakota, the Maltese Cross and the Elkhorn Ranch, and throughout the West. And by the way, North Dakota is where his presidential library is being built and will be open next July 4th. Unpaid announcement. Multiple use means, Mr. President, that land is sustainably used by the state and local population rather than preserved like a national park or a wildlife refuge. Multiple use lands are used by miners, cattle grazers, oil and gas developers, and recreationalists alike. They are not meant to be locked up. Mr. President, multiple use is a mandate, as I said earlier. It is not a suggestion, and that is what brings us here today. In the final days of the Biden administration, they approved the North Dakota Resource Management Plan, which governs the management of 58,500 surface acres and, Mr. President, 4.1 million acres of mineral estate across our state for the next 15 to 20 years. Despite vocal objection from the state, the people who actually use the land, the final plan prohibits coal leasing on over 4 million acres by inexcusably prohibiting all future development outside of a 4-mile radius from current development. Over 90% of North Dakota's affordable, reliable coal out of touch. It's gone. It also blocks 213,000 acres, or 44%, of federally owned oil and gas acreage from future development. This restriction alone deprives the state, and we're a small state, deprives the state of $34 million annually. And get this, the state's Common Schools Trust Fund, a minimum of $50 million. And if that wasn't enough, Mr. President, non-federal minerals are also held hostage to the federal government's management plan. As I mentioned earlier, these RMPs govern subsurface acreage. Whether it's coal, oil, or gas, federally owned subsurface minerals are intermingled with state and private mineral owners. In plain speak, the Biden Resource Management Plan is a de facto taking from the state and private mineral owners. Throughout the rulemaking process, this point was made very clear, but BLM ignored them. And it's unacceptable and needs to be undone. And I'll add, Mr. President, it needs to be undone by Congress so it's clear to the bureaucracy that this sort of resource management plan is out of bounds. By passing this resolution, we reassert congressional intent and remind the bureaucracy our boundaries are not optional. Mr. President, this rule will need to be replaced once we repeal it. And thank goodness Congress had the oversight in the Congressional Review Act to say no replacement rule could be substantially similar to the one it's replacing. But by no means does it preclude the proper replacement of a rule. I have the utmost confidence in Secretary Burgum and Deputy Secretary McGregor to get this done right, but this cannot sit on the back burner. Nearly 6 years ago, during the first Trump administration, I wrote a letter on behalf of a single constituent advocating for this RMP to be updated so he could develop some of his privately held minerals. They started the work, but unfortunately, the Biden administration finished the work. And while Congress is acting to repeal their disastrous plan today, the administration must swiftly replace this RMP, ensuring North Dakota gets the best long-term plan possible to responsibly utilize our natural resources. And I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Senator from North Dakota.
I rise in support of the resolution that Senator Kramer and I introduced to overturn the Bureau of Land Management Resource Management Plan for North Dakota. This flawed plan, finalized during the closing hours of the Biden administration, undermines BLM's multiple-use mandate and restricts access to vast taxpayer-owned energy reserves in North Dakota. It's yet another example of the Biden administration's overreaching Green New Deal agenda intended to block access to domestic energy production. North Dakota is an energy powerhouse and the third largest oil-producing state in the nation. Our energy producers operate under the highest environmental standards in the world. But the Biden administration's North Dakota Resource Management Plan ignores that record of responsible energy development. Instead, the North Dakota Resource Management Plan seeks to curtail coal, oil, and gas production by locking away taxpayer-owned energy reserves, and jeopardizing our nation's energy security. Under this plan, nearly 213,000 acres, or 45% of federal oil and gas acreage, is closed off to new leasing. It also closes off access to over 4 million acres, nearly 99% of federal coal, impacting development at all of North Dakota's major lignite coal mines. These restrictions will drive up supply costs for our baseload coal-fired power plants, costs that will be ultimately passed on to electric customers across the region. And we supply a large region of the Midwest with electric power. And this comes at a time when energy demand is rising, as manufacturing is brought back home and new industries like artificial intelligence and data centers are coming online. Our need for affordable, reliable energy is only growing. It makes no sense for the federal government to restrict access to the very resources needed to power our economy. In North Dakota, BLM manages 58,000 acres of surface land and about 4.1 million acres of subsurface minerals. Federal minerals are scattered and often intermingled with state and privately owned minerals due to North Dakota's unique split estate. So, when the federal government imposes blanket restrictions, as included under the Biden-era Resource Management Plan, it blocks development of state and privately owned minerals as well. The state of North Dakota estimates that this plan would cost $34 million every year in lost revenue from oil and gas alone, including revenue for school trust lands that is meant for North Dakota classrooms. I'm pleased to join Senator Kramer and Congresswoman Julie Fedorchak in introducing this CRA resolution, and I urge my colleagues to support it and help overturn this overreaching and restrictive plan. By passing this resolution, we can continue working with President Trump and Interior Secretary Burgum to take the handcuffs off and unleash North Dakota's full energy potential. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Jennifer Lee Mascott of Delaware to be United States Circuit Judge for the Third Circuit, signed by 17 senators.